The United States was committed to putting an end to the Native American tribes' increasing opposition in Montana in 1876. George Custer, their emerging star, was sent in. The so-called Golden Boy, Custer, was the government's go-to man because he was young, fearless, and eager for notoriety. He boldly led his army in what he believed would be a swift defeat of Sitting Bull and his warriors. Custer was expecting a minor conflict when he arrived at the top of a hill, but the scene astounded him. It was completely different from what he had anticipated. He witnessed one of the biggest Native American camps ever assembled, rather than a small group of warriors. Nevertheless, he showed no signs of dread. He raised his hat and yelled to his men, "Hurrah, boys!" with a sly smile and a confident tone. We possess them. What was he unaware of? He was walking right into a trap, and there was no help on the way. All his guys had been killed inside an hour. Instead of becoming a war hero on that day, Custer's name became associated with one of the worst mishaps in American military history. However, how could everything go so wrong? But before that, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any further updates. Let's go back in time and discover Custer's last stand, which was worse than we were told. Custer wasn't destined for stardom or influence. He was just an enthusiastic, ambitious Ohio country guy. He had a fantasy of accomplishing something significant, something that would live on in history. He was intelligent, arrogant, and constantly seeking attention even as a young child. He was accepted into the renowned military academy West Point in 1857. He wasn't exactly a model student, though. Let's face it, during his tenure, he was in trouble 726 times, more than any previous person. Nevertheless, his teachers noticed something unique in spite of all the rule-breaking. They thought he had the heart of a real soldier in his heart. His opportunity to shine came with the Civil War. And he shone. Custer immediately showed his fearlessness by constantly riding with his men and in the front of the charge. If there was a battle, he was in it, leading the way, and he refused to give commands from the rear. His bravery led to rapid promotions, and his troops adored him. He became a general at the age of 23, making him one of the youngest in American history. He was dubbed the Boy General by the press. He liked to stand out, had long golden hair, and had a dramatic flair. His most well-known moments occurred on July 3, 1863, during the Battle of Gettysburg. The tide shifted in favor of the North when he and his soldiers gallantly held the Union line and stormed against enemy forces at a critical juncture. Custer's wife received Robert E. Lee's surrender table as a present after the war, along with a message that read, "Your husband did more to make this surrender happen than anyone else." It was an enormous compliment and evidence of Custer's growing regard. However, following the war, things changed. In order to deal with Native American tribes on the plains, Custer was assigned to command the 7th Cavalry. He detested it. It seemed like a step backward, at least not yet. There was no glory in it. Then an opportunity presented itself in 1868. The Black Hills, which are sacred to the Sioux tribe and rich in gold, were the target of the U.S. government's desire for more land as it moved westward. The Sioux, however, had inhabited the area for many centuries and were unwilling to abandon it. Thus, the Fort Laramie Treaty was negotiated. It stated that if the Sioux ceased battling settlers and remained inside the limits of their reservations, they would be able to retain the Black Hills. However, a treaty is only effective if all parties uphold it, and that pledge would shortly be shattered. The problem is that the United States had no actual intention of upholding the terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty. The Black Hills were simply too desirable, particularly as gold rumors began to circulate. The government assumed that when white settlers eventually flooded in, the Sioux would become enraged and violate the treaty, providing the army with a pretext to advance. The majority of Sioux leaders accepted the agreement without being aware of this covert purpose. However, Chief Sitting Bull was one guy who refused to be duped. A proud Lakota leader, Sitting Bull declined to sign any documents. He was right to think that the United States would continue to expand regardless, and that fighting back was the only way to preserve their territory and way of life. He and Custer couldn't have been more dissimilar. Sitting Bull was serene, introspective, and profoundly spiritual, in contrast to Custer's flamboyance, wildness, and desire for fame. He actually got his name from his tendency to sit quietly and consider his actions before taking them. Don't be misled, though. He wasn't merely a thinker. He claimed to be a visionary, a warrior, and a chief who received direction from the Great Spirit in dreams. He also had a strong vision of his people defeating American warriors in the future. Holding that conviction close to his heart, he formed a strong coalition that brought the Lakota, Cheyenne, and other nearby tribes together. Together with Gall, a fellow warrior and valued comrade, he led attacks against American outposts and enemy tribes that had allied with the United States, such as the Crow and Arikara. Soon after the signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty, Sitting Bull's group started raiding American villages. The government was aware of a significant issue. To put an end to it, they needed someone brave and assertive. Who did they call then? Custer, George. October 1868 was the month. Winter was approaching, making it the ideal time to attack, as native populations would be more susceptible. Custer made his way to Oklahoma with the 7th Cavalry. They discovered evidence of a neighboring Cheyenne camp on November 26th. The following morning, Custer attacked unexpectedly. His troops killed anybody they could find after charging into the camp. While some warriors did fight back, women and children made up the majority of the victims. One of Custer's finest officers, Major Joel Elliott, took 20 men and pursued escaping Cheyenne fighters during the commotion. Custer remained and completed the raid. 103 Cheyenne had been killed at the end of the attack, which Custer saw as a major victory. However, his ego got in the way once more. What was the first error? The camp belonged to a friendly Cheyenne chief who had been attempting to make peace with the United States, so he attacked the wrong one. Any hopes of diplomacy were dashed by that action. A second error? There were numerous camps along the river, including that one. Custer was forced to flee quickly as other towns prepared for battle when word of the massacre spread. The third and worst error? Major Elliott never returned with his 20 men. Custer didn't hold out. Fearing more assaults, he abandoned them. Elliott and all of his men were ambushed and slain, and their bodies were discovered by search parties weeks later. Many members of the 7th Cavalry were incensed and accused Custer of deserting their brothers. Captain Frederick Benteen was the one with the loudest voice. He even penned a damning letter accusing Custer of being the cause of Elliott's passing. Custer was embarrassed when the letter was released to the media. They have never forgiven one another, despite Benteen still being under his authority. Custer received national acclaim for the Oklahoma raid in spite of all of this. He was portrayed in newspapers as a Wild West hero, and suddenly he was famous again. In the ensuing years, he led the 7th Cavalry in numerous conflicts with Native American tribes, seeking the fame he so much desired, despite the more complex reality of his choices. Custer was relocated to Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota in 1873. It was the ideal location for monitoring Sitting Bull and his increasing opposition. Two more significant characters joined Custer's story at this point. One of them was Major Marcus Reno, a sullen alcoholic. He shared Captain Benteen's distaste for Custer's haughtiness. Custer, however, had his own group of supporters. He was joined at the fort by his wife, brother-in-law James Calhoun, and brothers Tom and Boston. Additionally, he developed an odd bond with Bloody Knife, a native scout who was half Arikara and half Sioux. Bloody Knife harbored long-standing animosities towards Sitting Bull, particularly Gall, Sitting Bull's right-hand man. Since they were young, the two had been involved in a violent feud that eventually ended lethal. Custer was chosen to conduct a journey into the Black Hills in 1874. The official purpose was to locate a suitable location for a new army base. Actually, the true objective of the voyage was to discover gold and pique settlers' interest. It was more of a sightseeing tour than a combat effort. Reporters and photographers followed Custer, his brothers, and Bloody Knife as they hunted without any opposition. News of gold in the Black Hills quickly spread like wildfire, and suddenly there was a gold rush. The area was overrun by more than 15,000 settlers by the end of 1875. By asserting that the settlers weren't sent formally, the administration pretended that the Fort Laramie Treaty hadn't been broken. Behind the scenes, however, President Grant was in favor of everything. Knowing that a violent response from Sitting Bull would provide the United States with a pretext to permanently seize the Black Hills, he waited. Washington made a cash offer to the Sioux for the territory in September 1875, but they declined. The Americans would never stop coming, and Sitting Bull had been correct all along. As a result, the government threatened to identify any Lakota or Cheyenne who did not relocate to a reservation by January 1876 as hostile in November. Moving at that time would mean freezing to death. Therefore, the demand was harsh. It was midwinter. The army was still getting ready to move. Custer and the 7th Cavalry departed Fort Abraham Lincoln on May 17, 1876. Custer's friend, General Alfred Terry, was given command of the entire mission. According to reports, Sitting Bull's people were encamped close to the Yellowstone River, which is where the Powder, Tongue, Rosebud, and Bighorn rivers converge. The American military had three strategies. From the east would come Terry and Custer. General Crook would relocate from Wyoming, and General Gibbon from Montana. The concept? Enclose Sitting Bull's camp and trap it from all sides. Custer, however, pretended as usual that it was just another exciting adventure. To the annoyance of General Terry, he continued to go hunting with his brothers. Benteen and Reno were also fed up with it. Reno was so relieved when Terry sent him on a reconnaissance expedition down the Rosebud River. He hurried back with the information after spotting Sitting Bull's trail, but Custer called him a coward for not following it. The clock was ticking. Terry made the decision to divide up once more. From the north, he and Gibbon would descend the Bighorn. Custer would head south, following the Rosebud path. He was to wait if he discovered Sitting Bull. Everyone knew, however, that Custer would not wait. Someone jokingly said, "Custer, don't be greedy. Leave some glory for us," as Custer was about to go. "No, I won't," Custer answered with a sly smile. Sitting Bull was just where the troops had anticipated him to be. Sitting Bull had organized almost 8,000 men, women, and warriors in response to President Grant's severe commands. He was aware that the battle was imminent and that this might be their final defense as a free people. Though new leaders joined the cause, Gall remained his reliable comrade. Both sides were prepared for the imminence of truth. Crazy Horse was the most notable of all the warriors defending their territory. He was from a different branch of the Lakota, not the same tribe as Sitting Bull. Nevertheless, he exuded a wild energy that was youthful, audacious, and totally unafraid. Like Sitting Bull, he thought he had power because of his visions. In fact, that's how Crazy Horse earned his moniker. He was also the first to witness the approaching American forces when they began to march that July. General Crook's army had pitched camp close to the Rosebud River on June 17th. Crazy Horse, however, had no intention of waiting for them to initiate contact. He attacked first, something that practically no one anticipated, supported by 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. That had never been done before. To prevail in open combat, Native warriors typically had to vastly outnumber American soldiers. Crazy Horse, though, he disregarded the guidelines. In order to keep the Americans guessing where the next blow would come from, he ordered his men to disperse and attack from all sides. There was chaos. From the left, one charge, one more from the right. The Americans were unable to determine their target. They were totally overpowered. Crook would have been completely destroyed if Crow and Shoshone scouts hadn't come to his aid. He had to flee after losing 30 men despite their assistance. It was an unexpected triumph. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse had just defeated the U.S. Army head-on, something that many believed was impossible. Crook shook. He described it as the most amazing native combat demonstration he had ever witnessed. However, he kept his defeat a secret from General Terry and General Custer in all of that commotion. Sitting Bull, meanwhile, was aware of the approaching Americans. He thus made a significant choice. He instructed them to set up camp. He was then picked up and followed by some 8,000 Lakota and Cheyenne to an area close to the Little Bighorn River that they named the Valley of the Greasy Grass. They performed the Sun Dance, a customary ceremony there. Sitting Bull experienced another vision during the ceremony. He witnessed hundreds of American soldiers landing in their camp from the skies. He took it as a sign that a major triumph was imminent. Custer's soldiers were actively pursuing the situation at the same time. Unaware of Crook's earlier loss, they proceeded along the route through the Rosebud Valley. Bloody Knife, one of his scouts, saw something concerning. There were considerably more warriors on the path than Custer had anticipated, perhaps thousands. "We should wait," he cautioned Custer. "Gibbon and Terry must assist us." Custer, though, he had no patience. Then June 25th arrived. When Custer's scouts ascended the hills shortly after daylight, they noticed smoke billowing in the distance, which was Sitting Bull's camp. This was it for Custer, his time, his splendor. General George Armstrong. Custer had 700 men under his command. With confidence in his stride and glory in his mind, he divided these men into 12 companies. One company was left behind to guard the supplies, because no matter what, they couldn't risk losing food, ammo, or medical gear. The other 11, they were about to march into one of the fiercest battles the Great Plains had ever seen. Custer didn't fully trust his officers, especially not Major Reno or Captain Benteen, but he had no choice. He split his force into 3 groups. Custer himself led 5 companies from the north. Major Reno, with 3 companies, was to hit the village from the south, and Captain Benteen, with the final 3, would swing around to the west and support wherever needed. To keep their presence a secret, Custer ordered his troops to move behind the hills, out of sight from the native scouts. Around 3:30 p.m., they reached a ridge overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley, and what they saw next made even the toughest soldier pause. Below them lay a massive Native American village, stretching nearly 3 kilometers. Teepees lined the riverbanks, fires smoked in the air, and hundreds of horses grazed nearby. This wasn't some small gathering. It was an army. Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, thousands of them, far more than Custer had ever expected. Still, Custer's message to Benteen was short and sharp. "Big village, come quick, bring packs." Then, without waiting for reinforcements, Custer did what he always did. He acted. "Hurrah, boys, we've got them!" he yelled, raising his hat, and with that, he charged down the hill. Meanwhile, Reno's group had already crossed the river and entered the southern edge of the village. This section was home to Sitting Bull and Gall, 2 major native leaders. The attack came without warning. Reno ordered his men to dismount and fire. Bullets tore through the village, hitting tents, people, and animals. Women, children, and elders were among the first to fall. It was sudden. It was brutal. Sitting Bull tried to find a peaceful way out. He sent 2 warriors to negotiate, perhaps to buy time or avoid more bloodshed, but they never made it. Shot down before they even got close. Infuriated, Sitting Bull tried to ride into the chaos, but even his horse was shot from under him. His voice shook as he said, "My favorite horse is dead. I feel as if I've been shot." That was the breaking point. Without waiting another second, Sitting Bull gave the command, and that's when Crazy Horse and Gaul entered the fight. These were not ordinary men. Crazy Horse was a fearless Lakota warrior, deeply respected, almost mythical in his courage. Gaul was a battle-tested leader with a sharp mind and fierce loyalty. Together, they launched a furious counterattack. Their warriors struck fast and hard, surrounding Reno's troops and creating panic. Reno's soldiers were disoriented. Some fired wildly. Others tried to fall back. But by now, Reno had started drinking, and many say he was drunk even before the first bullet was fired. That only made things worse. As Reno tried to regroup, he was standing beside his scout, Bloody Knife. Now here's where it gets chilling. The native warriors spotted Bloody Knife. To them, he was a traitor, a native man fighting for the U.S. Army. A single shot rang out. Bloody Knife was hit in the head, and his brains splattered all over Reno's face. It was horrifying. Reno snapped. He panicked. He ordered a retreat. Order collapsed. Soldiers abandoned their horses, dropped their rifles, and ran into the river, trying to get back across, all while being fired upon from the other side. Far off on a ridge, Captain Benteen had heard the gunfire. Unsure of what was going on, he finally saw Reno scrambling up the hillside, bloodied, terrified, and missing half his men. "For God's sake, Benteen, hold your men and help me. Half my men are gone," Reno cried. But Benteen's face turned to stone. He asked just one thing. "Where's Custer?" There was no answer. Benteen sighed. It's another Major Elliott situation. He was referring to an earlier battle when Custer had left a fellow officer behind to die, chasing personal glory instead. Was history repeating itself? Just then, a messenger from Custer arrived with a handwritten note. "Come quick. Big village. Bring packs. Need help." Benteen read it, then did nothing. Maybe he thought it was too late. Maybe he didn't believe Custer could survive such a large force. Maybe he didn't care. Whatever the reason, he stayed put. For 2 long hours, the sounds of gunfire echoed, then slowly faded. One of Benteen's captains, unable to bear the inaction, finally took off on his own to see what had happened to Custer. And what he found was a scene of total devastation. Custer and all 5 companies under his command were dead. Bodies were scattered across the hills. Horses lay lifeless. Guns were melted from overuse. Some soldiers had been scalped. Others had their fingers removed for rings. Even Custer's own brothers, Tom and Boston, were among the dead. Calhoun, his brother-in-law, had also fallen. They had been surrounded, outnumbered, and wiped out. Not a single man survived to tell their side of the story. Custer may have doubted his officers, but what gave him courage that day was family. His brother Tom Custer, his younger brother Boston, and his brother-in-law James Calhoun were all riding with him. That made this mission personal. We still don't know exactly what happened during those final moments of Custer's fight, but here's the most accepted version. Custer had gathered his men on a hill, now known as Calhoun Hill. He was probably waiting for Benteen. Custer had a cruel strategy he'd used before. He'd take women and children from native camps as hostages to force surrender. It's likely he planned to do it again. He most likely had plans to take his soldiers across the Little Bighorn River, down the hill, seize prisoners, and make Sitting Bull surrender. Custer would have been direct. His charge must have appeared frightful as well. When Sitting Bull learned of Custer's approach, he later said, "We thought we were defeated." On the other side of the river, however, were already waiting and concealed native warriors. They started shooting. Meanwhile, Crazy Horse and the other combatants who had been pursuing Reno turned around and hurried to face Custer. Custer had made a mistake. Their might, their numbers, their rage. The Americans attempted an upward fall. His name lingers on at the hilltop, where Lieutenant Calhoun and his men dug in. Custer, his brothers, and the others retreated even more, to the location that is now known as Last Stand Hill. However, not all of Calhoun's soldiers arrived. Later, bodies were discovered strewn across the 2 hills. In a matter of minutes, Crazy Horse gathered a group of fighters who surrounded the Americans and prevented them from fleeing. Calhoun's soldiers were completely destroyed. What about Custer? He must have known that Benteen would not be arriving. The hills were teeming with fighters by that point. There are many of them. Custer had no chance, nor did the rest of his troops. All around, outnumbered. A vicious rain of gunfire and arrows overtook them. Some native fighters unintentionally struck one another during the ferocious and chaotic conflict. Who the last soldier standing was is unknown to us. Later on, however, Sitting Bull revealed what his warriors had told him. Custer stood straight like a cornstalk, but his soldiers had fallen all around him. Benteen and Reno knew when the gunshots had ceased. Now, 400 men were stranded atop what is now known as Reno Hill. Throughout the long, stressful night of June 25th, they dug in and repelled the attackers. The help didn't arrive until the evening of the 26th. Generals Gibbon and Terry were spotted by scouts coming from the north. Sitting Bull then issued the directive for his people to leave. Terry showed up shortly after. His initial query? Benteen's is the same. Where is Custer? The battlefield held the solution. 200 members of the 7th Cavalry were discovered dead where they had fallen. They had scalped some. A few were disfigured. When a private summoned Benteen over urgently, he was strolling among the dead. There was a body with 2 bullet wounds, one to the head and one to the chest. My God, it's him. The news arrived at the headquarters of the 7th Cavalry on July 6, 1876. They had destroyed Custer and his soldiers. A few days prior, on July 4th, America celebrated its 100th birthday, brimming with pride, optimism, and faith in its inevitable ascent. Fighting savages on the frontier, Custer was praised as a hero. Then the shock hit. Custer was dead, accompanied by 268 of his troops. The same individuals he was meant to combat were killed in a public battle. The nation was taken aback. How did this occur? Custer was blamed by some. Hungry for fame, he always hurried into danger. It cost him everything this time. Some accused Benteen and Reno of disobeying orders and abandoning Custer to perish. The native warriors were surprisingly underappreciated by Americans. However, they ought to have. The people of Sitting Bull had battled valiantly, expertly, and strategically. America had lost despite sending its best. What about Sitting Bull? Whatever came next didn't scare him, but instead of victory, he found disaster. Custer's last stand became a symbol of hubris, misjudgment, and the tragic cost of war. It wasn't just a military loss. It was the death of a myth, the end of an era where the U.S. believed its forces were invincible. And as for the native warriors, that day at Little Bighorn became one of their greatest victories, a moment of resistance, pride, and power. But even that would be short-lived, because what followed was more conflict, more suffering, and more forced removal. Still, for one brief moment in history, Crazy Horse, Gall, and Sitting Bull proved that even the most feared general could fall. What are your thoughts about this video? Let us know in the comments below. If you found these hidden truths fascinating, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from America's past. And go ahead, click on the next video on your screen. See you next time.